Hello, this is Steven. I am your certainty in these difficult COVID times by bringing you these wonderful podcasts that I'm sure you're very addicted to. And today I am speaking yet again with somebody else. The first time a woman, actually. I should be aware that I don't get any listeners that complain about gender bias or things like that. But they would have a point. It's actually quite weird that it's taken me so long to interview a woman. But anyway, besides that, I am speaking with Nathalie Nahai today. Well, not today. This intro is recorded another moment than the actual interview. So I spoke with Nathalie, though, and she is what is she? It's quite hard to describe her in one word. I think she's a bit a jack of all trades. But I would call her somebody who is really an expert when it comes to consumer behavior and our irrationality on the web. She has also written a book about the topic called Webs of Influence. And it was a really interesting conversation. We went into a lot of mind-boggling topics. I'm sure some of you will get a headache again after listening to this episode. And some topics we tackle is magic mushrooms, just to keep it a bit more lightweight. Existential threats. That makes the lightweight gone now. If we are slaves of our own mind, how limited our minds are, how fascinating they can be as well, and how we can maybe hack them a little bit, use tiny tricks to become happier. And then secondly, isn't that a foolish thing to become happier? Maybe you should crave something else or stop craving altogether. I don't know. And we also talk a bit about the meaning of life. But that is a very short segment because, as you all know, there is no meaning. Everything is useless. But you can give meaning to things yourself by, for instance, helping somebody else. For instance, a guy that gives you podcasts, you can support this guy by going to 20angles.com and sharing his work or making a donation. If you happen to have €5 or whatever lying around, it's much appreciated. That's about it, I think. It was a really fun conversation. Actually, Nathalie asked me quite some questions as well, which is annoying because I'm used to asking the questions. It's a much easier job for me. Certainly when it comes to existential questions like who or what are we, which I ask every guest for people that are new to the podcast. So yeah, she got me thinking a bit as well. So shame on her for that. Anyway, this intro is becoming way too long, and by me speaking this sentence, it becomes even longer. Let's stop the intro and please enjoy the podcast. I don't have an actual a tune between the intro and the actual podcast yet. I don't feel like making one, so I will just make a weird noise if you don't mind. So here we go. That was quite good. Yeah, all right. We're all set. So thank you very much for joining the podcast. You're actually the first woman I interview. So...
thanks for having me.
You're welcome. You're also my first international guest, so there's 2 times you're the first.
Excellent.
So the goal is that we find out a little bit with the podcast who we are and why the hell we are here on this planet. What's our reason for being? What's the meaning of all
Great,
this?
starting with a nice big question.
So it's a very, I think, good goal for the end of the podcast if you could find an answer to the meaning of life. So let's start with the question who we are. If somebody would ask you, let's imagine one of these HR managers, and they ask you, who are you? define yourself in 3 labels or 5 labels, and give me 5 strengths and 5 weaknesses, what would you reply to yourself?
So 5 strengths and 5 weaknesses?
However you want to. Suppose I'm an HR manager. I think it's actually, it's always like these funny, awkward situations where you're supposed to have an exact idea of who you are, like a fixed thing in time that has been existing all along.
Okay, so I'm going to try for the 5 strengths and weaknesses. Maybe that'll be a nice way to approach this. So let's start with weaknesses. Easily distracted.
Mm-hmm.
I can be quite competitive. I need to have complete lack of stimulus around me in order to concentrate, so that can be tricky when you're with other people.
Certainly these days of social media all around us.
Oh yeah. I struggle with that. That's 3. What else? I pick up social cues from other people in a way that I find difficult, so I can be very sensitive to how other people are feeling, which in some ways is really helpful, but in other ways it's actually really difficult because it means I can't just concentrate on myself as much at times. And the 5th, I need to have complexity, otherwise I get bored. I don't know, does that, I mean, yeah.
I don't think you're suitable for the job at this company, but because you have to turn your weaknesses into positives, otherwise
maybe that's why I've never had a job. Oh, I see. That's probably why I've never had a job in a company before. So I guess strengths, I'm extremely curious. I love diving deeply into subjects and exploring them. I really love being around people. I'm very creative, and I see connections between a lot of things.
Okay, interesting. I think it's funny how difficult it is to answer this question. Like I've had periods where I've had a lot.
How would you answer that question?
How would I answer this question? Oh, now you're asking very difficult questions.
Yeah.
I think weaknesses. The first is I have no weaknesses, so that's a weak. No, I think some people actually say that
hubris.
on an interview. But I think I'm quite impatient. I'm not very good at reading social cues. I only have 2 now. Really difficult. I'll say a strength first. I'm quite funny sometimes. I'm good at sports. I like to listen. I'm very curious. And I only have 4 strengths, I think. And then weaknesses.
I'm sure you can find another one.
Obviously don't reflect enough on myself. I think I can be quite self-centric sometimes. And I'm very, very prone to worrying. It's like if there is ever a national championship in worrying, I would probably win. And Belgium is very risk-averse, so that's saying something. Yeah. And sometimes I'm not that spontaneous, I think. So those are mine.
It's quite a rich mix when you're made to think about these questions.
Yeah, it's like, and then like the HR manager is sitting right in front of you and they want you to know it directly. Otherwise they say, you haven't really thought a lot about yourself, now have you? But the reason I bring this up is because actually a question that I think is interesting to ask is, are we really a fixed self? Like, do you feel like there's like a fixed Nathalie at the center of your consciousness that's controlling everything? Or how would you define this thing that you call yourself? It's a very hard question this late in the evening, so...
It's a lovely question. It's funny because I've had a couple of conversations around this theme literally in the last 2 weeks. And one of the things that I was exploring with someone was maybe more of a Buddhist idea, or I know you also find it in some Hindu practices as well, but the sense of what is it that remains consistent when we track ourselves back through time. And it's clear that when you look backwards at yourself, so the Stephen that you are now is different than the Stephen you were when you were, let's say, 20 or 15 or 10 or 5. And so what is it that is the golden thread that courses through those different iterations or moments of you, or me for that matter? And from the perspective of this Buddhist understanding, one might say, okay, well, if I'm able to perceive myself, to experience myself, then actually the constant is in the awareness. So the sense of being able to conceive of there being an I and a you. So that's one answer, which is quite ephemeral, I think, in some ways, but which is something that we can cultivate if we do meditative practices, most of which I don't do, by the way. So it might sound
then
great,
you're
but,
clearly lacking something if you don't meditate. You have to meditate these days.
Yeah, clearly lacking something. So I think that's one way of approaching the question. Another way of approaching it, I think, when I think of the psychological research around this that I've looked at, when we look back at our lives, at the different versions of us that we were, we can admit to ourselves, yes, there's been a lot of change. Maybe I have been different at different points in my life, but we actually find it very hard to assume that same variation going forward when we imagine ourselves in the future. So there's this sort of bias that we are kind of fixed, that the person that we are now is it. And of course that's not true. When you look back through an entire life, you find that actually we are very fluid. And when you look at personality research, you find that yes, of course, there are constellations of traits that
you have like these MBTI types
consistent over time. Yeah, or I'm thinking more, the more robust model that I've worked with is the big 5. So you can think of it as openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, and emotional stability. And there's another one which is looking at empathy. And what you find is that some of these traits do change over time. So, for instance, if you take magic mushrooms, then your level of openness may well increase, and that's what studies have found in certain
I can
people.
concur with that.
Or over time, for instance, I know, well, maybe it's time to have a little experience.
Well, I don't live that far from the Netherlands,
anything,
so...
just
It's actually
okay.
a topic I was going to into much later, because I noticed on your podcast you talk quite a lot about psychedelics as well.
Yeah, it's a theme which I'm exploring at the moment as it relates to our sense of identity and nature connectedness and the permeability of what we consider to be our self, which is kind of what we're exploring a bit here. So I think there is the propensity for those traits to change. So I think the idea of us being fixed, as far as I can tell, does not reflect reality, that we are entities that change and grow over time, and that you can achieve great change through all sorts of practices, whether that's meditation or the use of transformative medicines or the use of therapeutic processes, whatever. But I think that there are certain qualities that, even though they may express themselves differently, I certainly feel are representative of the person that I am. So, for instance, I've always been quite energetic. I've always liked people a lot. I've always been very creative in some form or another. And that might express itself at different points in my life in different ways. But I feel like there are some fundamental ingredients that make up my physical incarnation here. That are probably a product of my biological system, which, in combination with the environment and context, yields to the person that most people know me as. That's it sounds like I'm going all doors of perception here, but
I tend to like have a similar view also, like reading Buddhism, not because just it's in these days and then people think, oh, you're so spiritual. But actually, I think it makes a lot of sense. And just if you can dissolve your sense of self just a little bit, it's quite peaceful. Like if you would think, if you would scrap out all thoughts that involve I or self, you wouldn't have that much thoughts left. And I think an interesting question to ask then is, what is left? Suppose all the questions about yourself are left. What is left? And for me, it might sound a bit hippie, but I would almost call it like some kind of innate goodness, like just maybe it sounds very hippie, but some sense of love and compassion for yourself and other people. But then we create this so-called self.
I love the sound of that.
And we create it also out of love, I think, but in kind of a very sometimes unhealthy way, in a kind of neurotic way to protect ourselves. Maybe it's our reptile brain speaking. Yeah, but I think for that reason, just more people should read these Buddhistic texts, actually just to get a grasp how their mind is working, how their mental storms are working, why they are there, and yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice way of putting it, actually, these mental storms, because it does feel like that. And I know that, when you're in a moment or a state where everything feels like it's crowded and busy and tumultuous in your mind, it's I find it really difficult to extract myself or move myself beyond that state, or to unhook myself from that state. So this idea of being the observer and witnessing the mental storm, as you so beautifully put it. But
the practice is obviously very more difficult than the theory. I think.
Yeah, and it's discipline. It's the whole thing of do the same thing every day. And I know I'm sure some practitioners listening will say to me, no, you don't have to do the same thing. But I don't know. I rail against that, much to probably my own loss. If I could cultivate more discipline, maybe I'd be much wiser. But yeah. For me, these I always have like the metaphor. I really like cycling. I've been cycling quite a lot in the last 2 years. And sometimes I was cycling, for instance, in Patagonia, and there's a lot of wind, really a lot of wind. But still you cycle and you accept the storm in some way, and you want to go on. You can also just hitchhike and stop, but something keeps you moving. And I think, like on the bike, I accept there's a storm, I accept there's wind, and I feel into my emotion and I know, okay, this is the reason I'm doing it. And now I kind of use the same metaphor when I'm mentally overloaded. For instance, I have been diagnosed with autism, not that I would be an extreme case, but I kind of imagine myself being in a storm and then just accepting the storm and feeling why I decide to cycle through it and how I know it will pass on. So that's my metaphor at the moment for managing my mental state. I like the sound of it.
Anyway, we were talking about how we like a product of causes and conditions. So you have a lot of expertise in behavioral science and also, let's call it, the irrationality of people. So do you think from that angle we are merely a product of causes and conditions? And is there any free will involved? What's your take on that?
Whoa, that's such a hard
I'm really
question.
asking the most difficult questions you can possibly ask somebody.
I think the first thing that comes to my mind when you ask that is actually family members. So quite a few of my cousins have had, and my brother also, have had babies. And very quickly, when you meet these little ones, you notice, or at least I've noticed, such differences between one and the next, in terms of all sorts of traits, in terms of engagement in the world, the way they engage in the world. And so I think the first thing that I would say is that clearly there is something that we're born with, but there are certain traits that we're born with, whether that's, I mean, now we're sort of getting more into the metaphysical. But whether that's something that arises from our biology and from our genes and it's purely material, or whether it's something that's more transcendent, like some sort of essence or soul or something like this, I'm not equipped to answer. But I think that we're definitely born with certain propensities and traits and characteristics. And then, of course, as we engage in the world and we're taught to change our behaviour so as to elicit certain responses. So, for instance, if you're a child who's quite creative and loud and your parents don't like it, you learn to curb certain behaviours in order to not anger your parents and in order to survive at the most rudimentary level.
Otherwise your parents would kill you.
It could be that you... Yeah. Well, I think clearly that's an extreme case, but I think there is something that we can point towards and say, well, human babies are so vulnerable and so dependent on their primary caregivers for such a long time that the existential threat of death is actually very high, because we can't fend for ourselves. So even if the actual threat is low, nevertheless, we completely are dependent on our caregivers around us to keep us alive. So I think there is a really fundamental fear at some level of what it means if we don't get that primary care. And so adapting ourselves to elicit the love and the care and the attention of those around us, I think, is something which is evolutionarily very adaptive. But it also means that if you're in a situation where your parents or primary caregivers can't tolerate certain expressions of your behaviour or your personality, then we risk closing those aspects of ourselves off to repress them, or
that's maybe why people
lessen their
after
expression.
A few years they decide to take some psychedelics or do some meditation, maybe to rediscover these things they have cut off from the world a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, it's, living in social societies as we do, we always have to negotiate our needs and desires and expressions of who we are with those of others. So I think there's always going to be a way in which we have to find how best to express ourselves and function in a social network. But at the same time, I suppose the people that I've met who have been the most at peace with themselves or at home in themselves are the ones who have managed to do some integrative work to connect those parts of themselves that maybe weren't allowed to be expressed when they were younger. So the sense of how whole can I be? So I sometimes think of it as like an orchestra. So I have a lot of different interests and I'm quite complex as a person. Mm-hmm. I imagine every one of us is complex in our own ways. And I sort of think, well, I'm hoping that through the work I do, I can bring all of my different parts, all of the different parts of the orchestra into music together, so that none of them are left behind. And that's kind of how I think of therapeutic work of any kind. It's how do we get to bring all of those parts of ourselves, the whole
That's orchestra, a nice metaphor. Maybe I will start using it for myself. It's kind of like with this podcast, please, I feel okay. I call it 20 angles because I'm interested in 20 and more angles. So it's a nice way of putting it, I think. Mm. But let's go back a bit again to the behavioral science angle, because we humans, like if we talk about free will, we could ask the question: do we have any free will in decision making? And our brains have different systems of decision making, like Daniel Kahneman has shown in his research. So it feels like a lot of times we are really on autopilot, I think, certainly if we are online.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, free will is the big question, I think, isn't it? If you're looking at it from a behavioural sciences perspective, and you mentioned Kahneman and the sense of having conceiving of the brain or the way in which we engage with the world, having two systems, so that we either operate in a fast, automatic, heuristical way. So we use cognitive rules of thumb based on previous behaviour to predict what we're experiencing in order to speed up decision making. That's there, and if we rely on that most of the time, then what space does that leave for slower, more deliberate, contemplative, logical thought? And I would suggest that clearly we have a desire to be able to find some way to think through things logically and analytically, and you see that through the development of, for instance, the Socratic method or the scientific method, that we seek ways in which to engage with the world that try to reduce our bias. But of course, we're really complex and messy, and so
and actually we use our bias to understand our bias, which is quite ironic.
Yeah, and actually that really points towards something really interesting, which is that, when we conceive of all of these extraordinary things, we're still conceiving with human minds, with biological minds. And so, we are limited by what we're able to understand as biological beings. And so there is that. I mean, there is a beauty in it, I think, because it means that whatever we're experiencing can also tell us something about our internal world. And I don't know. I mean, I think that that's quite poetic. But as to free will, I know that there are things and practices that one can engage in to give yourself a little bit more space between feeling something and reacting to it. And there are ways to shape one's shortcut behaviours. So, for instance, if we're talking about, let's talk about if you are someone who experiences anxiety being in social situations, and your natural reaction or your learned reaction, whichever it is to avoid eye contact and shut down and shy away.
Oh, you're talking about me now.
Which is a very understandable reaction. Well, about all of us in certain points, but it's interesting that you see yourself in that. So I think many of us have experienced that, right? When you're in a place, maybe it's a party, and you're just, either it's something you experience more often or maybe less often, but I think most of us have had that feeling where we just want to curl up. And so in that instance, if you experience that over and over again, then it can become very easy to retreat and to expect certain responses to us. But you can also teach yourself to maybe breathe for 10 breaths and allow yourself to be present with someone else. So maybe they make the first move and have a conversation starter for you. And then I think through things like that, through hacks, through first of all being aware of your own tendencies and how you tend to react in certain situations, you can then figure out certain hacks to buy yourself a little bit more time to give yourself the opportunity to respond differently. And I think that for me is the really interesting spot. So what is it that we can do to give ourselves a little bit more flexibility in how we respond? And I think there absolutely is that possibility for us as humans.
Yeah, I think for me what really helped, because I found it really recognizable, is that if you feel like this social anxiety, it's just first you should be aware of it, and it's like you say, allow a little bit more space between the being aware of it and actually the reacting. And I think if you are mindful, it's already half of the battle. And then if you can accept the feeling coming to you, a bit like the storm, like you feel the storm coming and you just let it pass by, and you know it's all good intentions in the end, and then I think it goes away. But if you miss that first step of recognizing it, then the other steps don't matter. I think like you'd always go back to the same habit. And I think sometimes that's a bit the pity of our times, is that we are always distracted all the time. We have these notifications, this, that, or we need to do this and this. We always say we must do and we must do. And that way our brain never really has time for these little pauses, like you mentioned, I think, to just reflect on the behavior or patterns of thought that come back.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the other thing that I've found, which is a very simple practice but very helpful, or at least I've certainly found it very helpful, is naming things as they come up. Whether you just do it quietly in your own mind to yourself, or you name it to trusted friends. So, for instance, in the UK, culturally speaking, we're not necessarily a culture that express or name our emotions easily, which can make things quite funny and eccentric in terms of comedy, but also quite painful and alienating in some instances. And so, for instance, naming to friends when I'm feeling anxious or sad, or when I need time alone. It's this whole thing of not wanting to offend the other person. That's something I've really had to put a lot of effort into, and I've found that by naming things, so for instance, if someone comes up to me and they want to have a deep chat and I just need space, by naming that and just saying, look, I recognise that you want to have a deep chat right now, but I really just need some space. Can we arrange a time to have that deep chat? Even just that creates enough space for me to then be able to feel like I have set a boundary, and it allows me to relax a bit more. And to the other person, it means they can trust that you're going to be honest with them, and it gives them permission to be okay with whatever feelings arise for them. Of course, over time, this is something that one hopes is cultivated. But I have noticed a big difference with my social groups when one or two people start naming things sort of in a non-violent way, but just naming the things that come up as they come up. And I'm not talking about all the time, but just, occasionally when it's needed.
Yeah, as long as you don't name things all the time, otherwise it would be a bit weird in a social situation. But I think maybe there's like a...
And I have met people who do it a lot, and I find it a bit difficult to communicate with them, because then it's just constant inward checking, which, I don't think one necessarily needs to be doing that all the time. Otherwise you miss out on all the other good stuff.
It could give a rise to some awkward situations, but that's also, I think, just funny. And then you can actually name the awkwardness. So you can go on and on then.
Yeah, that's true.
When we speak about technology, I really have the feeling it sometimes is turning us into a zombie. I know with your podcast you investigate a lot our relationship with technology. Would you say you agree with that statement, or do you think it should be more nuanced?
I have the tendency to think that everything is quite nuanced, but I take your point. I think that the way that we are currently using the technology available to us doesn't really serve our ability to contemplate things more deeply. So if you're constantly finding ways, and I totally am guilty of this, I do this every day. If we're constantly seeking ways to give ourselves little dopamine hits and
I love dopamine,
be stimulated, and to I know. Don't we all? This is the thing. This is the tricky thing. If you're encountering technology that's specifically designed to elicit a high engagement rate, so you've got the infinite scroll, you've got likes, you've got retweets, engagements, notifications, unpredictable rewards, of course it's going to be extremely difficult for us to actually retain our agency and consciously, deliberately sort of make our way through the day. So I think there is absolutely some truth to the question or the statement of, technology making us zombies. But I think, of course, if we change the way that we relate to and use our technology, then the benefits also are extraordinary. So it's that question of how do we identify the behaviours which actually aren't helping us in terms of what we personally want to achieve, and then how do we adjust I would suggest generally the technology, because it's easier to adjust notification settings and access to one's physical phone than it is the behaviour to notifications. How do we change the context so that it's easier for us to do what we actually choose and want to do, rather than deplete resources trying to ignore something which is designed.
Yeah, it's really like, you can call it addiction engineering. It's really just making an app or a product or whatever, really making it into like a clinical addiction almost. And I feel like... and
then it's extreme cases, it can tip towards that.
I feel that, like, if you are interested in psychology and maybe whatever self-improvement or whatever you call it, you might be conscious of these triggers, these notifications, this way of captivating our mind with technology. But I think for people that maybe have other interests, maybe they just get sucked in and they have just no clue what's going on. And then I wonder, should there be some regulations, maybe from government, about how much and to what extent can companies use or sometimes abuse our irrational behavior for their own purposes?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think, what we've seen with, let's talk about data harvesting, for instance. What we've seen with the Cambridge Analytica files and all the other thousands of companies that I would imagine exist that also take advantage in the same way, is that until legislation is brought into being to make illegal many of the most harmful practices, then there are going to be people and companies who take advantage because they want to make money. I mean, I think most of us want to be able to get ahead in the world, and some of us do it more or less ethically than others. But I think what we can say is that for those who are most vulnerable, laws are important. They're there to protect people from being abused. And I think in this case, in extreme cases, then there should be legislation to protect people. I suppose the question is, where do you draw the line?
Yeah, once you start regulating, when do you stop? How much does that
depend on culture? And it's also a very contentious issue because it's very complex. And some people, for instance, are very comfortable giving up a huge amount of their attention and privacy. So, for all of their behaviours to be tracked by Facebook and what have you, in order to get personalised experiences or convenient and free platforms. For some people, that's a price worth paying. Yeah. And for others, it's absolutely not at all. So there's a big variety in response there.
In the end, it's not all bad because still we get the dopamine and we feel happy maybe in the short term, but still it gives us something, otherwise we wouldn't crave it.
Yeah, and I think, I'm someone who really thrives on having stimulus, so whether that's dancing or food or projects or talking or whatever it is. I think when you're someone who is sensation seeking, which is related to dopamine and other various personality traits, it can be extra seductive. But of course, the tricky thing is that it can also lead to behaviours which maybe are gratifying in the short term, but they don't necessarily contribute to our longer term sense of well-being. So there's, again, it's kind of that negotiation that needs to take place of how much immediate instant gratification do I want now, and how does that impact my longer term happiness and well-being? And that's a very personal question that only each of us will ask and know. Only each of us will know the answer for when we ask it of ourselves.
I think it's interesting that it might give us gratification and a feel-good moment for a while, but does it necessarily make us happy? And then another interesting question that I've discussed with other people on the podcast is the quest for happiness really a smart thing to do?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define happiness. How do you define happiness?
It's a good question. I'm usually used to me asking the difficult questions to the people.
Sorry.
But yes, I think I define happiness as, I think in a moment I would describe it as a feeling that I am natural, that I'm not like, I don't have to, I let things be as it is, kind of maybe in a Buddhistic way. I just accept things however they are, and I might wish things to be different, but not like in a neurotic way, like it has to be this and I have to think of this and this. Then I think maybe even peace would be my definition of happiness. But then in the long term, like what is long-term happiness? Is it like a function, and then you calculate the surface integral, the surface area of the integral, and if that matches some number, you're happy in the long term? I don't know. What's your definition?
I think happiness, like sadness, are temporary states through which we go. So, for instance, I remember having conversations with my dad when I was much younger about this, and we talked about the difference, his perception of the difference between happiness and contentment. And he would often say, happiness is kind of more of a peak experience. It's something that I might feel, for example, when an amazing song comes on the radio and I just have to dance and I just get this rush of just expansive joy and energy and and I just feel very vibrant and alive. But of course that's a temporary state and it's wonderful to experience. But then what my dad was pointing towards was a sense of contentment, which kind of connects, I think, in some ways to what you were saying, which is a baseline of being at ease with what is. And I don't think that's happiness necessarily. I think that's more, as you say, like a sense of peace and a sense of resting in experience. I hear a lot of people who do lots of meditation say, well, this is even possible with dysphoric state. So, when you're feeling sad or anxious or depressed or angry or vulnerable or any of these states that you can name that we try to escape. I'm not so good at that. But I think if a life is to be well lived, we also need the difficult, challenging experiences, hopefully not traumatic experiences, because that's something entirely different.
That's of course another category if we're talking about trauma. It's interesting. Well, if we talk about trauma, it's a completely different category than most unhappy experiences, of course. I talked with my previous guest. His name is Dirk de Wachter. It's a Dutch name. It probably sounds weird to you. But he's a psychiatrist and he... Yes, sometimes it sounds nice, these names. He wrote a book, The Art of Being Unhappy. And it's actually a very philosophical essay. And in the end, he says that according to his opinion, we should probably give up the quest for happiness or unhappiness or even the labeling things of being either happy or unhappy, but focus on meaning, but then not falling into the trap in getting whole neurotic about, I want to have meaning, is my job meaningful? But just like by having a feeling you're helping other people, it can just be helping a friend or some family. And I think maybe that's the easiest way to be happy, because then happiness sometimes arises spontaneously, you notice. And I wonder, and I think we can...
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was thinking about what you just said about spontaneously, that it can arise, and I think there are practices that I know that can reorient the way that we experience things. So, for instance, two practices that come to mind. One of them is gratitude journaling, so naming things that you feel grateful for. So, for instance, I'm really grateful for hot showers because I spent some time when I was in my 20s in the Amazon basin where there was cold water, and I really missed hot showers. And so I always try and think back to that moment, and I'm always grateful for hot showers. So the practice of gratitude. And the second one, which I found it might sound a bit odd, but if you're someone who can fall into patterns of neurotic thinking or anxious thinking or complaining thinking, or even complaining to friends out loud, something that I've noticed that I read a while ago that seems to work is to catch yourself before you're about to verbally complain about something, and either stop there and have the thought and try and let it go, or stop there and find something else to say out loud that you're grateful for instead, which sounds really odd, but over time you start orienting yourself towards noticing the things that you're grateful for. And it's again moving yourself out of this habitual unthinking pattern and into something which initially is more deliberate, but then over time becomes second nature. And that comes down to sort of
that's
the
interesting
plasticity of the brain and stuff. But that's super interesting.
I think my girlfriend would love when I would start that practice, because I complain a bit too much sometimes, according to her perspective.
Well, maybe try it for a month and see what happens.
Yeah, that's also like an interesting thing you can do. Like you say, try it for a month, like just these micro actions. Like if things seem too much, if you're overwhelmed, like just take a very small step, and then it's like a domino again. Like, I feel like it's the same if you feel bad. If you just say, okay, let me just accept the feeling for 5 seconds, and then you're down to 1 minute, and before you know it, you feel a lot better. So so I want to maybe talk a bit more about the psychedelics, because I notice you are also quite interested in the topic. I've heard an interview on your podcast with a researcher. So what gets you interested in this?
Well, I think from the primary perspective of the deeper question, which is similar to what you're exploring, it's, what is it that we are, and how do we gain a greater variety of experiences that can then inform what we imagine we can be. So, for instance, one of the interesting things with psychedelic research that I've come across is that when you have threshold experiences, so threshold doses, high doses, in a set and setting that is facilitated well, where you feel safe and you feel supported, you can end up having experiences which enable you to, in some instances, come to term with past trauma, or to experience yourself as at one with all of that which is also a beautiful experience to have, like this unification experience, that it gives us access to states and experiences that are otherwise inaccessible in our waking life. And I think it takes quite a lot of either courage or naivety, depending on how you approach it, to get yourself into the situation. I know that, in the UK, when mushrooms are still legal, because they grow naturally in the UK from, I think it's October through February, and cowpats on fields, it's something which is there, that just naturally occurring. You can have a lot of fun on certain psychedelic compounds. So there is also a huge scope for play, and there's also a huge scope for profound and transformative experiences. So I think, there's a great variety in what it is that can be experienced when you start to engage with that whole world. But I want to say a caveat, because it's become very trendy to talk about and experiment with these sorts of compounds. And of course, they're not without risks, and if there's any risk of having, for instance, schizophrenia in the family, or other particular psychological there's certain illnesses which can be worsened by having unregulated psychedelic experiences, then it really does pay to do your research and to just approach these things with respect and with an educated approach, because yes, they're fun, yes, they can be profound, but also they're pretty powerful and they can have lasting impact. So one has to be aware of a bit more about what these things do and how they interact before engaging them. That's what I would say. I tend to agree. I think there's certainly a risk for dissociation. And actually, on the ayahuasca retreat there was a guy there. I think he had post-traumatic stress. He was ex-military, and he actually got into quite a psychosis because another guy was snoring during the ceremony. He got completely mental at the guy because he said, "Because of you, I'm distracted and I don't have any visions," and he really threatened to kill him, and really security had to escort him. He went completely insane. So I think if there's I'm not speaking scientifically, but I think if there's something you're repressing and you don't have the attitude of I really want to accept everything that comes, I think your brain can get into some kind of defense mechanism and just get into a psychosis. So I've seen the risks. Yeah, and I think for the people listening, if you want to dig into the research and you want really good, robust resources on this, there's a lot of really good, rich research that's being done by Imperial College in the UK. Also, the Bleckley Foundation and MAPS, they're sort of two of the more well-known ones, but the Imperial College are doing some amazing work on this. And and there's a book also that's a nice introductory piece of literature that explores this in a very fun way, but also exposes some of the risks and goes into the history and context of the use of psychedelic and hallucinogenic compounds. And that's a book by Michael Pollan, which is called How to Change Your Mind. So if you're listening to this, and
I've read it.
Oh my
it's
gosh,
really good.
Yeah, that these are some nice starting points, because what we really need is access to good, robust, ethically conducted research and information, and from there, hopefully, also the Psychedelic Society in the UK is another organisation which is good at supporting people through research and through certain practices as well. So there's a lot of good stuff out there that can help support people who are interested.
Yeah, I think people should definitely first read enough and maybe talk with somebody professional before they really try to experiment with these things. I was actually also thinking of interviewing somebody from the Imperial College, because they really they're, I think, leading the whole research renaissance on psychedelics, I think.
There's a lot of great people there. I can put you in touch with some of them if you like.
That was kind of the thing I was hoping you would say. So even though I have autism, I am quite good at saying something subtle.
I think you're great at subtlety. It was a nice joke.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm also good at awkwardness and then naming the awkwardness, because I just learned that naming awkwardness is apparently something good. So
I think it's helpful. Also, I remember when we first met and you named your autism, and I remember feeling immediately more at ease in our interaction, because it meant that then I could understand the context of our conversation better, which meant I could then relax as well. So you naming discomfort or preferences or whatever it might be is also great for the people around you. If they're open to it, then it's brilliant.
Yeah, I have the same when people say they have a weakness, or maybe weakness is not even the right word, but just like you say, some context. It just makes me see them, they're also a human being. I can relax. They also have weaknesses. And I know your weaknesses now because I asked them. So that was also a brilliant psychological thing I did there.
Cheeky monkey.
But do you have any real profound or lesser profound experiences on psychedelic compounds?
Yes, but actually I prefer to keep those private, because I find that
I don't know, I'll edit this out.
No, that's okay. I don't mind keeping that part in the conversation, but I find that often people are very eager and quick to share their experiences, and in my life at least I found that there are certain intimate experiences that I've had that I cherish, and that by keeping them closer they retain their potency more. And also I have a sense of discomfort with our tendency in this culture to share everything, and I don't know that it's always something which serves the individual. So for me, my sense for me is that I can certainly vouch for having had some profound experiences, and not just with psychedelics, but also with other practices that induce trance-like states that are completely psychedelic free. But the experiences themselves I keep to myself.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes even meditation can be kind of a, let's call it a psychedelic experience in some way, because you kind of stop constructing things in the way you want them to be, and you just get like more the raw sensory input of how things are before you screw them up sometimes. So I think there's a lot of parallel lines between the two.
Yeah.
And I also think, I should bear in mind that I don't advocate psychedelics too much, but I think if you have tried psychedelics in a good research way, then if you meditate, it's an advantage, because you know, let's call it, what you're after, or what what part of your consciousness you can investigate more, I think. Anyway, I think I have to mind your time because
I'm going to have to head off.
talking already quite a bit. So I will first think we should think, have we discovered who we are and the meaning of life in general?
I think that's going to be an ongoing question as long as humanity lives.
Yes, I think it's nice that we can ask the question, and it's interesting actually. The previous person I interviewed, he wrote a book called Love, and he tries to find a definition for love, and he also says, well, I think I will never know the answer, but it's just the fun of it, of investigating. And I think it's the same with this podcast a little bit.
But that's part of the fun of being human, is that desire for answers and to explore, and our sense of curiosity that keeps us going.
Yeah, I agree. So one question I asked to everybody at the end is, if you could write something on a piece of paper and put it in the mailbox of every human being on this planet, what would you write on it? It's also difficult, I know.
The first phrase that came to head. Yeah, the first phrase that came into my mind was try to be kind to yourself, because I think that most cruelty and suffering that we inflict on other people is because we're in distress and we lash out. And I think
that's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think that if we found ways to be kind to ourselves, we then are able to open up more. We can then empathise more readily with the people and the other beings with whom we share this beautiful place. And if we're able to be in that space of sensitivity and connectedness with ourselves, then hopefully we can be more compassionate with the living world. And of course, that's something that right now we're absolutely crying out for, or the world is crying out for. Yeah.
I think that's a very nice message. I would be happy to have that in my mailbox. So is there one book you would recommend to all the listeners? You wrote a book yourself, by the way, which you actually gifted to me, which was a very nice gesture. So if I ever write a book, I will gift it to you now.
Thank you. Yes, please do.
So you wrote a book, Webs of Influence, so on the psychology of online persuasion. Yeah. Actually, it was really useful because I used it in the past for one of my websites. So I will put the link at the...
Thank you.
So this is the marketing talk I do now. So people can find it if they want. But is there any other book besides your own that you would maybe recommend?
Yes, I would heartily recommend The Enchanted Life by Sharon Blackie, who I also had the pleasure of interviewing on my podcast, on the Hive podcast. So if you want to listen to that, it's beautiful. But she's an extraordinary writer, and I found that book deeply moving and deeply connecting. So if you're going to read one thing this month or this quarter or this year, then I certainly strongly recommend that one.
Okay, so I will Google it. I think that were my questions.
All right.
So is there maybe any place people can find more? Where people can find out more about you or your work in general?
Sure. So I have quite an unusual name, which makes me a bit easier to find, although the spelling is tricky. If you go to nathalienahai.com, so Nahai is just Nahai, then it has links to the podcast, to my books and stuff. And then I'm also on Twitter at Nathalie Nahai, and I'm on Instagram at Nathalie Nahai. But that's more for my more contemplative practice of art and the Hive podcast on Instagram. So yeah, that's it really, I think. Thank you so much for inviting me in conversation and for these really searching, difficult but very rich questions. I don't know if I've contributed much to the conversation, but hopefully it's interesting for people.
Well, I have the same feeling every podcast of myself. So I really enjoyed the interview, and thank you very much for taking the time and for even going over time.
Oh, well, my pleasure. Thanks.
Do-do-do-dum. Yeah, I still have to get used to that tune. But anyway, this was the end of the episode, as you might have guessed, because we said farewell to each other at the end. So that's probably some cue that the episode is coming or has come to a end. And that means that we will hear each other again. Well, maybe not. It depends on your interest in this podcast. If you are interested, you can go to 20angles.com. For me, it's actually so boring to say this all the time at the end. Please go to my website. You can make a donation, blah, blah, blah. You can share on social media. But, however, it's worth mentioning these things because, well, yeah, for me, it's really nice when people send me an email afterwards that the podcast make them think a little bit, because that's really why I do all this work. So, and if you just share it with people, then it just helps to get the word out and to have more interesting conversations with people. So yeah, that's it. And if you are a multimillionaire who has money for like buying me a coffee or something, then you can just make a donation on the website. You can even do €1 if you want, whatever, just so that I can make it a bit more professional and I can make a bit more work from my passion. So yeah, that's it. And in future episodes, I will certainly talk with a researcher of psychedelics, because this topic keeps coming back, and I have a few other surprises in mind. So I hope you can sleep this evening now, because you're probably very anxious to know what these surprises are. But you just have to wait, unfortunately. All you need is just a little patience, as Axl Rose would sing. I will not sing it for you, because I think then Apple will certainly kick me off their podcast system. So no singing from me. I'm sorry. Anyway, auf Wiedersehen.